Look, I'm getting pretty annoyed with all of these fantastic artists writing some of the most mediocre piles of crap ever. Especially when they have such amazing ideas that they just really can't string together in any meaningful way. And lately, I've just had a tendency of getting tricked into reading these types of stories, and none of them have really been that interesting. Except for Banya the Explosive Delivery Man, but it still isn't an exception to the mediocrity. And I think this one might have hurt the most out of all of them, just based off of how good the opening chapter actually was. It builds up this brutal, war-torn world, and introduced a character that just really didn't care about any of it, and was just there to get his job done as efficiently as possible. And it really just brought up the question of how far people are willing to go for their jobs, and I really don't think that most people would go through the amount of shit that Banya had to go through in that first chapter. That chapter alone completely sold me on the story. It's such a shame that the rest of the story just couldn't hold up as well. And honestly, I just really want to complain about it, because the art alone is just absolutely amazing, but there were so many good aspects to the story that just couldn't capitalize on anything, and everything just felt like a jumbled mess throughout the entirety of it. But before I go too far, there's going to be a lot of spoilers. It's only like 38 chapters, so I can't really avoid telling a lot of the things that annoyed me because it is just the story. The premise of the story is fairly simple. The main character, Banya, had lost his memories and just ended up becoming a delivery man for the Gaia Desert Post Office, who isn't really affiliated with any specific country or region. And he works with two other characters, Mei and Kong. And just quickly, Mei had one of the greatest character designs I had ever seen, personally. I absolutely love her in every way. But the world that they're in has a ton of conflict and loads of monsters and just terrible people in general. So these three characters are all fairly good at fighting and can hold their own, and they're really good at navigating the world and going through all these routes to each region. And the first half of the story is basically them going through different deliveries and really just building up the world around them and all of these creatures and conflicts that are going on in a very episodic feeling way, where everything's more of a standalone adventure for each delivery, which is one of my first gripes about it. I really don't like episodic styled content, but it does a good job of building up the story before getting into the more serialized stuff, where there's an actual story rather than just these one-offs. But the actual story behind everything is Banya's past being uncovered and everything that he did before his memory loss coming back for him, basically. Before all of the events in the story take place, Banya used to be in a group of extremely proficient killers called the Slayers, and I guess one day he had enough of the killing and decided to revolt and went after their actual leader, who basically had him hunted down, and he fell off of a massive cliff into a very tiny river, and that's where his memory loss comes from. And there's a whole scene where the leader's shouting at his men saying to find the body because he's not dead, but everyone else thinks that he's dead because he fell such a great distance. And it's really interesting stuff, but they just breeze through it extremely quick. And honestly, at this point, I'm thinking this is exactly the same as Scissor 7, except obviously Scissor 7 didn't come out in 2006, but this did, so technically I think it's like the original, so they're very similar, but Scissor 7 just does a much better job at the whole thing. But Haircutter versus Badass Delivery Man, they're also extremely different, so I'm not going to sit here and compare the two like they're the same story, because they're just not entirely. They just have very similar ideas. But enough of that. The Slayer's leader is under the impression that he's going to take over the world, so the entirety of their involvement is trying to take over the world through this dragon that they try to summon and control, but you technically can't. I think it's actually the god of destruction or something. And their entire idea is to gather up these summoners that might have a chance of controlling this godly being, which is just a stupid idea, but it might work, so why not? But up until that point, they're just thinking that Banya's dead, and it doesn't really matter to them, but they still want to hunt him down, and they end up running into him during one of their outings, and they go back and report that he's still alive, and then it becomes more of, we need to hunt down Banya while simultaneously trying to take over the world. Which, I mean, fair enough, you got your grudges, but if they could focus on one thing, it would have been much easier for them to either take over the world or kill this unkillable monster known as Banya. But I think that covers the basic elements of the story without going too far into each little aspect of it. And to be honest, like, just that alone, I think it sounds really interesting. Like, there's enough substance there to build a really good story around the entire thing, but it's just written in a way that it doesn't really fit as well as it could. I think the major problem with it is that it's 38 chapters and the pacing is extremely fast. It takes the first half of the series just to build up the world and the characters, and then it runs through everything in like 15-20 chapters. And it is just not a story that you can fit in that amount of space. So they jump around, and I'm assuming they cut tons of content from the story. So when you're reading it, it just comes off as they're jumping from point to point without actually building anything up, and none of the characters are actually fleshed out at all. Like, you hardly get to learn anything about Banya's past, Mei's past, Kong's past. Everything just runs through it extremely quick. Chapter 2 is the introduction of Mei and how her and Banya meet and actually start working together. But that's basically it. Mei, other than that, is a mystery. And honestly, I don't even remember if there's a Kong chapter at all about his past, but he does get his own, like, delivery adventure, which introduces another character that is extremely underused. It's this little girl, Mido, and she's a summoner that was captured, and the entire bit is Kong really wants to protect her. But things happen, and she falls into the enemy's hands again, and it's just a whole mess. But then she comes back at the end of the story because they try and force her to control the dragon, and that's basically all that she does throughout the entire story. You get a little bit of her background information and, like, what ended up leading to this point in time, but for the most part, none of these characters get any actual development, and they just kind of get thrown around to hit every story beat without actually letting the characters exist, which is such a shitty way to write these characters. Like, Mei and Kong start off as, like, main characters, and by the end of it, I think chapter 24, they're just thrown out completely, and they're, like, left to their own. So you have no actual ending with them, and they're just never brought back into the story. Banya just leaves to confront his past without them, even though they're both very willing to help. And Mei's awake at the time and just doesn't give a shit. Which, I mean, fair enough, but there are a couple moments where Banya brings up the fact that he's trying to protect both of them, but it's almost like you're expecting them to come back and they just never do. At least give me something, just give me a chapter of them reuniting at the end or something. Just like a silhouette of them in the distance as they're waiting for Banya to come home. It would have been such a better wrap-up to the story than what we actually got with it. And oh boy, did we get a good ending. I have absolutely no idea how it actually ends. The ending is such a fucking jumbled mess that none of it makes sense. Like, here's a major spoiler. There's a character that they've been traveling with for like 5 chapters who just kind of showed up out of nowhere. His name's Moi. M-U-A-H, Moi, I don't know. Mua, it doesn't matter. Anyway, he gets revealed to be the god of destruction, and logically, he's going to destroy things. But then it goes into his backstory, where he's not actually the god of destruction, and he just wanted to make one summoner happy, so he made this little girl happy by waging war against everyone because she asked him to, and it just devastated the entire, world for whatever reason, and now people see him as the god of destruction. So he's just really upset with humanity and probably going to kill everyone. So he spends a couple chapters traveling with Banya and this other girl summoner whose name is Jian, I think, but he does that in order to understand them more. But the entire time they're just fighting. By the way, he has this obnoxious fucking sword that just has a mind of its own and just talks constantly and wants to drink everything's blood, and it's just a weird thing to throw into the story with no explanation whatsoever. It's never even remotely explained as to what this sword is or how it's talking like this, or is it a curse, is it a mystical sword or something? What the fuck is it? There's a whole bit where it tries to introduce itself and it says it's the legendary infamous sword told in stories, and just it gets cut off because it's one of those joke characters that everyone else in the story finds annoying. But what the hell is this? I need answers. There's a lot of comedic relief in the story, but nothing gets explained, unless I just completely overlooked that part, but I don't remember it. And even skimming through it right now, I don't see it at all. But back to the shit ending. Like, they built up this Slayer leader character to be the big bad villain, and his entire goal was to control this god of destruction. So when the time comes to actually face the god of destruction, they just kind of have him stand there and threaten the dragon, and then Banya comes and stabs him in the back. And him and Banya had been fighting back and forth throughout the last few chapters, just having such an anticlimactic ending for this big bad villain. It's just not the content I was expecting or wanted. I think the ending would have been so much better if he actually managed to control it, and then they had to try and bring this god of destruction back around to the good side, even though both sides are kind of shitty. But instead, they kill off the actual villain, and then they just kind of talk to the dragon. Did I mention the god of destruction is a dragon? I don't remember. Anyway, he's a dragon, by the way. And they just kind of talk to him and realize, hey, he doesn't actually want to kill us all. That's pretty cool. Anyway. And then they leave. And Banya says, I am a delivery man. And it ends. Like, what? I really don't understand how this is a good ending at all. The entire story is just this jumbled pile of mediocrity with, granted, some of the best artwork I have ever seen, by the way. Like, I know I've just complained about it, but like, I still can't get over how amazing everything looks in this manhwa. Like, apart from some extra long looking torsos and just some rigid looking characters in general, everything was pretty damn perfectly drawn. I think it's pretty obvious at this point if you've seen any of my other videos, but in general I put art at such a high standard that when stories actually meet that standard, I'm just in heaven the entire time. Even if the story kind of sucks, which this one does, but it genuinely, it sucks in a really fun way. Because I didn't find myself being bored at the story whatsoever. It was all really exciting and held my attention the whole time, but that's really not enough to say it's a good story. It's honestly another one of those stories that I would say, if you really like art like me, it's worth reading. If you really care about story and dialogue and building characters, probably not for you. There's a lot of really interesting characters that just get no actual development, but they look fantastic the entire time. The designs are all amazing. The ideas in the story are great, but they're just executed really poorly. But that's just my opinion, which doesn't really matter at all. If it interests you at all, you should go read it, because it is a pretty enjoyable read. It's just one of those stories that I'd rather complain about than praise, but there are some really good aspects to the story that do make it worth reading. And it's fairly short, so if you got some time to kill, why not? I think that's just about everything I wanted to cover with the story, apart from the comedy in the story, which is not like a major focal point, but it comes up quite often, at least in the beginning of the story, and it kind of teeters out as the story progresses, but there are some bits where it's like the overly exaggerated comedy art style that like Boichi can switch between quite often. Actually, it's done in a very similar way to how Boichi draws, which does explain why I like the art so much. Anyway, that's it. I'm done. Thanks for watching.